In my opinion, one of the most overused expressions in modern vocabulary today is the expression awesome. It's a pet peeve of mine, I guess, because from time to time I just get a little weary of hearing people talk about all of the things that are awesome. You know, I went to a movie the other night and it was awesome, and we went out for dinner after that, and the meal was just awesome. I attended a party a while back. I saw a program on TV and it was awesome. And the problem to me is, if everything is awesome in our descriptions, then eventually nothing is awesome, because awesome means something that is above the average. It's above the common. It stands higher and more glorious than anything else. And if everything is described as awesome when there's an exception to the rule and it's even better than ever, then how am I going to describe it? And so the word awesome, in my opinion, and your opinion's worth as much as mine, but I always think my opinion is more valuable than anyone else's, and I think we all fall into that category. But in my opinion, it's overused. But there are some things that could and should be described as truly awesome. And this morning we're going to talk about an account in the life and in the ministry of Christ that is truly awesome in so many different ways. And I'm going to ask you this morning, if you will, to turn to the passage under consideration. It's found in Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4. And we're going to look at this chapter beginning at verse 35. Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 35. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." And when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly, and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Many years ago, I memorized the King James Version of verse 41. And it still touches my heart. I am awestruck by this expression. What manner of man is this? Can you imagine being an apostle, being one of his disciples in that boat, and seeing what has just transpired? And they indeed were fearful. They might have been afraid of the storm, and they were terrified, but how much more terrifying it was that the one who was with them in the ship, in the boat, should stand up and say, "Peace, be still," and rebuke the waves. And all of a sudden there was a great calmness. No wonder the text says that they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The context, they had had a hard day. Jesus had had a hard day of preaching, and the disciples were awestruck at what they saw here. What manner of man is this? A man can't stand up in a boat in the midst of a storm and just say, calm down, and the waves and the wind and the storm immediately respond in obedience. What manner of man is this? Jesus went out from the land so as to make room for all who had gathered to hear his teaching back in verse 1. And again he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole multitude on the land facing the sea. Can you imagine attracting a crowd like that today to hear the gospel? I can't even fathom that. And here such a great multitude gathered together that there was no room for everyone. So he got into a boat, went out a little place into the water so that the people on shore could still hear what he was saying. And there was such an assembly there. They were gathered, no doubt sitting all over the beach. Some of them trying to get as close to the water as they possibly could. Maybe the waves lapping up on their feet and cooling them during this hot, arid time. And feeling some refreshment as they were hearing the words of life. Some people sitting around maybe on driftwood. Others on wrecks of fishing boats that had been there for years. Wherever they could find a place, here they were sitting and listening to Jesus, listening to the words of life. And from a boat, he expounded to them the words of life. And finally, Jesus and his disciples, after they had finished, were alone, and Jesus was worn out, physically exhausted. He extends to his disciples an invitation. There's the story of the storm, and then there's the awesome miracle, and then comes the question after they witness the miracle: what manner of man is this? What manner of man is this? About whom we read in this text. Well, he is a man who invites us to travel with him. As he invited his disciples then, he still invites us. He invites us to go with him, to be led by him. And the one who wants to be our companion still speaks to us today. In verses 35 and 36, on the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. Let's cross over to the other side. He wanted them to be with him. Now let that sink in, if you will, please. He's saying to them, let's cross over. I want you to be with me, and I want you to go with me as we cross over to the other side. That invitation was loaded with promises. Look at it from their standpoint. The promise of the fellowship on the journey. I can remember years ago, Brother V.P. Black consenting to come and conduct a gospel meeting for us in the Kennett congregation when I was working there in Kennett with the Slicer Street Church. I can remember his coming, and he was offered a rental car. He turned that down. I offered him my car because I also had an old falling apart Suburban, but I offered him that car, and he turned it down. He said, I'd rather you go with me wherever we go. And you know what? I didn't look at that as a chore at all. I considered it a great privilege. This great man of God, this great gospel preacher, wanted me to be with Him. And what an honor I felt it was to be in His presence. Imagine Jesus saying to them, I want you to go with me to the other side. I want you to be with me. Do you know He still says that? I want you to be with me. Oh, what a fellowship for a journey that must have been. And there's the promise, there's the implied promise of safe passage. Go with me to the other side. That tells me we're going to get to the other side if He is with me. And so there was that promise. And then there was the promise of the fellowship on the other side. What a sweet communion it would be. Nothing separating them. Finally, they would be away from the crowds, the multitudes, and there you will be with me. I see that this parallels Jesus' invitation to us today. One statement of that invitation is found in Matthew chapter 11, beginning at 28, when He says, Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Listen to that. Come to me. Can you imagine what an awesome blessing that is? I want you in my presence. I want your fellowship. You need my fellowship. And now I'm opening the door. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And aren't we heavy laden? I've been struggling for about a week and a half, along with a man that I have known since he was just a little boy. And he's struggling with difficulties in his life. And it breaks my heart that I just can't step up the way I might have when he was a little boy. And I was already old enough to help take care of him. How it broke my heart, and still does, that I can't just step in and solve everything for him. Even if I were in his presence and he in mine, that would not be an assurance that everything is going to turn out all right. But if Jesus is with me, no matter how difficult the things might be that I'm experiencing, I know that ultimately things are going to turn out as a blessing for me and for His kingdom. Here on this terrestrial shore, we get weary. We get tired. We're worn out. We become discouraged. Sometimes we feel like laying aside our armor and surrendering to the enemy. But Jesus invites us, travel with me. And He says, if you go, He commissions us to go and teach and baptize those who are taught, and then continue discipling them. And He says, as you do that, lo, I am with you. What a comfort that is. He says, I am with you always, even to the end of the way. Those who accept His invitation to travel with Him to the other shore have the assurance that He is with us, the one who could still the seas, the one who could call to a halt all the raging storms round about them. He is the one who will be with me. No wonder He could say to His disciples at a time of great stress for them, let not your hearts be troubled. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. He wants me with Him. Just as He invited these disciples, you come with me, and together let's go to the other side. And Jesus still says, you come and become one with me. And one day when we're on the other side, we'll be there together forever. What manner of man is this who could make that kind of promise? He's the man who is with us in all the storms of life. Sometimes the storms are so tumultuous. They're so terrifying. They're so dark that we can't see the daylight. But He's promised, I'll be with you during all of the storms. Verse 37 again. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. Imagine a great storm like that. High winds. You can imagine that the thunder was rolling. The lightning probably was so blinding and terrifying as it flashed about them. And the waves were beating against the boat with such a ferocity that the waves were coming up over the sides of the boat. And it was filling with water, and they were beginning to sink. This picture reminds us of how powerful and devastating some of the upheavals in our lives can be. I've seen some storms, some natural storms, tornadoes, that have devastated houses and taken people's lives. And the problems that this life offers are so many times so beyond our control. It's as if we are in the midst of a hurricane, a tornado, something we can't control at all. And it's then that we most need Jesus. What manner of man is He? He's the man who can stand and say, "Peace, be still," and bring about the calm that we so desire and need in our lives. Ever since that day, when man sinned, our earth has been in travail. And it's going to continue to be that way. There's going to come no time when all will be peaceful in this world. The Apostle Paul said this in Romans 8:22. Listen carefully. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. The kind of agony that comes upon a woman as she's about to bear a child and she's in the birth pain, she's in labor. He says the whole world is like that. It has been ever since this old world fell into sin, when man sinned and brought sin into this world. But in this time, we have the option of traveling with Jesus. Now, while we're traveling with Jesus, get this, the storms still hit. The storms still hit. These disciples were traveling with Jesus, but still a storm came when they were with Him in the boat. They were traveling with Him. They obeyed Jesus, did what He said to do, and still a terrifying storm came. Even though you're a child of God, you may be passing through a devastating storm in your life. I know some who are. You're a child of God, you've obeyed God, and still there are devastating storms in your life. Well, amazing things can result from the storms that we endure because of His presence. Think of storms that we read about in the Word of God. Jonah's storm caused him to come back from a period of backsliding. Paul's storm, while it might have closed one door, opened many other doors for evangelism over and over and over again. The disciples' storm here, oh, it tested their faith. Don't you care, Lord, that we're about to perish? They even wondered for a moment, does Jesus really care what's happening to us? It tested their faith. But you know what the result was? It put a steel rod in their backbone. It infused them with strength that enabled them to be disciples who can stand and move forward. The overriding truth is this: they were in a storm, but Jesus was with them in the storm. You may be going through storms in your life, but if you are a child of God, Jesus is with you in the storm. We may be straining to even see the daylight, but He's with us in the boat if we belong to Him. And He still has the power to rebuke the storms about us. And with a whisper, "Peace, be still," comes quietness and relief and reprieve. In Hebrews chapter 4, listen to the assurance that this passage gives us. In chapter 4 of Hebrews, beginning at verse 14, the writer says, "Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." Since we have a high priest, Jesus, who's passed through the heavens, let's hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but He was in all points tempted just as we are, yet without sin. He knows what you're going through. If you belong to Him, He's with you. What manner of man is this? He's a man who is up to the occasion. Look back at the text for a moment. In verses 38 through 40. He was in the stern of the boat. He was in the stern, asleep on a pillow, and they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I love that song. "Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou fall asleep?" They were wondering, how can this be? "Teacher, don't you care? You ask us to come with you. You promised to take us to the other side, and yet the storms are threatening our very lives. Do you not care as you sleep in the stern of the boat?" But he awoke, and he arose. He rebuked not them. First, he rebuked the storm. I think that's important. He arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? Why are you so fearful? How is it you have no faith?" Jesus was asleep, had become weary. I know Isaiah 40 says we have a Lord who doesn't get tired. He doesn't become weary. But Jesus became flesh. He became a man so that He could become weary. And the text says He became weary and He had to get some sleep. Why did He do that? Because He wanted to know what it feels like to be us. to become so weary as sometimes we do. He became a man to identify with us. Paul said, Philippians 2, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in form God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made of himself no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men." He didn't have to come into this world as a man. He chose to because he wanted to identify with what you and I experience. Do you ever get weary during the storms? Do you ever become frightened, dismayed? He knows what it's like. He experienced it. Hebrews 4:14 through 16, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." Let's not release it. Let's hold fast, knowing that Jesus is our high priest. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our infirmities. You're going through something difficult, becoming weary, becoming discouraged, feeling hopeless. This passage says Jesus can sympathize with you. He knows what you're going through, and He's still with you in the boat. He's still with you in the boat. What manner of man is this? He arose and said, "Peace, be still," and there was a great calm. I can't imagine how noisy and how frightening the sound is when there's a storm at sea. But the raging winds and the waves battering against that boat all of a sudden ceased. And there was simply the sound of the water as the boat strolled through the water, and the sound of their hearts beating, and there was peace. He's the same Jesus. The waves ceased, the sea flattened, the moon broke through. Now they could see, and the only sounds now were the sounds of His loving voice. And they asked, "What manner of man is this?" He's the one who's in the business of calming storms. Whatever the storms are in your life right now, whatever the storms are in the lives of people that we know, if Jesus is in the boat, then there's security. Let's share Him with our friends, with our loved ones, so that they too can have the security that as we remind ourselves through these passages of Scripture that He's with us, that they can have that assurance and that comfort and that security as well. And if you don't have that security, don't hesitate to make Him the Prince of your life, for He's the Prince of Peace, and oh, how we need that peace. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation this morning in any way, I would encourage you to make known your desires as together we stand and sing.